On a bitter winter morning, Miss Marple notices more than just the chill upon the glass within the delicate lace of frost lies. A message, fragile yet deliberate. What begins as a fleeting pattern on a frozen window soon unravels into a chilling mystery only she can decipher. Section 1. The garden party's icy interruption. A thin silvery light touched the frost-etched hedges of cold thorn green. As the villagers gathered for Lady Penrose's annual winter garden party, normally held in late summer, the season's event had been rescheduled to the first thaw after Michaelmas, in hopes that the greenhouse would protect guests from the morning chill. Yet despite the bright sun, a brittle nip lingered in the air, and delicate patterns of frost still clung to every windowsill and pane. Miss Marple arrived just as the silver chime of the conservatory door announced her presence. Dressed in her customary lavender cardigan and sensible wool skirt, she paused for a moment to admire the lace-like crystallizations on the glass. It struck her then, in that instant before she joined the throng, how the frost sometimes offered messages of its own. Natural symmetry turned almost deliberately into shapes that hinted at hidden meaning. She made a mental note to look closely. That small detail, she thought, might one day prove significant. Inside, the warmth was almost startling. Potted palms and winter jasmine clustered beside steaming urns of Mrs. Harrow's famous Earl Grey, infusing the air with a heady mix of tea and earth. The villagers hovered in small clusters, Mrs. Tilling gossiping with the vicar about the youth of the Choir boys, Mr. Ridley laughing too loudly about his new pheasant shooting shotgun, and the young Miss Cromwell shivering over her napkin as she nibbled on sugar-coated almonds. At the head of the room stood Lady Penrose herself, tall, pale, and bewelled in pearls that reflected the light in soft glints. She was chatting animatedly with Colonel Haversham about the upcoming hunt when a sudden, muffled cry cut through the hum of polite conversation. Conversation halted. Cups hovered in mid-air. The vicar's eyebrows shot upward. Even the colonel's grip on his teacup tightened. Miss Marple moved instinctively toward the sound. It came again, a short, choking gasp, almost smothered by the hiss of the radiator. The guests parted as she passed, giving way respectfully to her unassuming dignity. She found the source of the disturbance at the far end of the conservatory, where a wide bay window faced the frosted shrubs outside. There, slumped on a low divan, lay Mrs. Marwood, one of the quieter residents of Coldthorn Green, known for her penchant for sketching botanical illustrations. Her fine, ice-white hair spilled over the plush fabric, and a single teacup had fallen from her grasp, its contents steaming into the frosty air like a ghostly wisp. The mournful sigh of concern rippled through the crowd. Lady Penrose was already at her side. "Good heavens, Agatha," she murmured. "I thought you were discussing the new magnolia blooms with your sketchbook." At Miss Marple's approach, the older woman's perfumed composure broke. She sat up abruptly, clutching her throat. A brittle rasp escaped her lips. She tried to speak, but could only manage a faint, strained whisper. "The window." "Look." Miss Marple knelt beside her. One gloved hand steadied Mrs. Marwood's arm. The other lifted the fallen teacup to halt its further spill. With characteristic calm, she asked, "What is it you see, my dear?" Mrs. Marwood's eyes fluttered, wide and glassy. She pointed to the frost on the window. Miss Marple turned, her gaze traveling over the complex, feather-like patterns. At first, it looked like the random artistry of ice crystals. Then, but for the thin sheen of condensation, behind it a slender finger had traced letters MURD. ER. The words slanted across to panes, the strokes wavering as if written by a trembling hand. Miss Marple pressed a finger to her lips, absorbing every nuance, the slightly deeper indentation of the letter R, the faint smudge at the end of M, as though the writer's strength had ebbed away. The word was unmistakable and chilling in its simplicity. A murmur rose. "Murder," echoed Mrs. Tilling, her voice quavering. But who would write such a thing? Mrs. Marwood coughed once more, her breath rasping like dry leaves. I saw him here, she gasped, just before. Her head lolled to one side. Lady Penrose lowered her gently onto the cushions as Miss Marple checked for a pulse. Too late. Miss Marple announced softly, She's gone. A stunned silence fell. The vicar crossed himself. Colonel Haversham frowned, rigid as an oak. Even the puddled warmth of the conservatory seemed to recoil, as though frightened by the stark message on the glass. You mean someone murdered her? Mr. Ridley blustered, stepping forward. His coat rustled with uncertainty. Indeed, said Miss Marple, rising. She placed a calming hand on his arm. But let us not leap to conclusions. We do not yet know how or by whom. Lady Penrose rested a trembling hand on Miss Marple's shoulder. Agatha, what are you thinking? Miss Marple inhaled the warm, scented air, letting the details settle. The victim had been drinking tea, a hot beverage, perhaps a comfort on a chill day. The window's frost was still fresh. The room had not warmed enough to melt it. Yet the word appeared clear, unmistakable. And Mrs. Marwood, finder of floral secrets, had been the one to discover it. What I think, Miss Marple said, gaze drifting back to the frozen scroll on the glass, is that this was no accident. Someone intended us to know the cause of death. If only we can decipher for whom that message was meant. The village doctor, summoned by Colonel Haversham, pushed through the gathering. He knelt, examined Mrs. Marwood's wrist, then stood, removing his spectacles. Cause of death appears to be poisoning, he announced. The TC here, fine crystals lining her cup, cyanide, perhaps, or something similarly rapid. A collective intake of breath sounded like a storm gathering. Poisoning, the doctor had said. The finger-etched words spelled out murder. The murder had indeed arrived, silent, invisible, but unmistakably deadly. Miss Marple's keen eyes swept the room. The spilled cup, still warm. The ornate teapot, its spout thinly flecked with dregs. The absence of any struggle. The pristine footprints in the dew-darkened tile. And most telling of all, the window itself. From outside, one could see no handprint, no sign of someone opening it from without. The message had been written from inside by the victim herself, in her final moments, a key clue, already overlooked by everyone but the astute observer. Miss Marple's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, tinged with sorrow. The game had begun. Now it was her turn to listen to the whispers of human nature, and to find out which of these genteel neighbors had turned to murder in cold blood. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. Tremulous hush settled over the conservatory as villagers exchanged startled glances, uncertain where to focus their shock and fear. Mrs. Tilling's rose-cheeked face had turned ashen. She clutched the carved wooden back of a chair as if bracing against a gale. The vicar's lip trembled, an uncustomary break in his solemn composure. Colonel Haversham stood rigid, his military bearing battling with genuine dismay. Mr. Ridley, eager for a target, darted his gaze from one neighbor to another, searching for someone to blame. All around them, the muted hubbub of polite conversation dissolved, leaving only whispers and uneasy murmurs. Well, if this isn't the most dreadful thing, Lady Penrose exclaimed, her voice quavering. She hovered near the corpse-strewn divan, arranging cushions with perfunctory calm as though she could restore order through mere etiquette. Murder, in our own garden party, no less. Who would dare? Her question trailed off as several villagers edged closer, peering at the chalk-white features of Mrs. Marwood, and the ominous words sprawled in frost on the window. Miss Marple, seated beside the still figure, watched these reactions with keen interest. She noted the slight tremor in Mrs. Harrop's hand as she dabbed at her handkerchief, the brittle set of Mrs. Ridley's jaw as she crossed her arms, and the subtle narrowing of the vicar's eyes as he regarded Lady Penrose. Each micro-expression, each barely perceptible shift in posture, was a thread in the tapestry of human motive, waiting to be tugged at and unraveled. Mrs. Tilling, ever the village gossiper, turned to Miss Cromwell, her voice pitched in a mixture of horror and excitement. "My dear, did you ever imagine cold-blooded murder at Lady Penrose's fate? Only last week, we were admiring her new greenhouse orchids. Now this." She shuddered dramatically, her gaze flitting to every guest as though one of them might strike again. Miss Cromwell, the young spinster who lived next door with her 5 cats, nodded vigorously. "It's beyond belief. She was such a gentle soul, always so absorbed in her botanical sketches. Her voice broke. She pressed a thin white hand to her lips, eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I simply cannot see any reason someone would harm her. But that's where you and I differ. My dear," observed Colonel Haversham, his voice low and steely. He offered a handkerchief to Miss Cromwell, but his gaze remained fixed on the window's chilling message. "In my experience, people do not harm others for no reason at all. There must be motive and opportunity." The vicar stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Let us pray for guidance and for the poor departed soul. But we must also consider practicalities. The message, murder, written in frost. Who could have done that without having to open the window? It must have been Mrs. Marwood herself." He gestured to the corpse. "She must have used her last strength to warn us. God rest her gentle spirit." Miss Marple inclined her head. She rose and laid a comforting hand on the vicar's arm. "Quite so, Reverend. But one wonders why Mrs. Marwood chose such a public stage for her message. If her intention was to spare us foul speculation. Writing in frost seems a most theatrical flourish." She paused, letting the question hang in the steamy air. She knew her time was short. Yet, why risk the message being overlooked until it was too late? A ripple of dismay swept through the assembled villagers. Mrs. Harrop, the local school teacher, bit her lip. "Miss Marple, if I may, do you suspect the murder was deliberate poisoning, then? And that she knew before it overcame her?" She nodded toward the doctor, who was still examining the fallen teacup. "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "The doctor's observations on those crystalline traces strongly suggest a fast-acting poison." She glanced toward Dr. Carter, the village physician, who looked uncharacteristically pale. "Dr. Carter, forgive my interruption. Did you confirm the presence of poison?" Dr. Carter adjusted his spectacles and straightened. "Yes, Miss Marple. Preliminary analysis indicates prussic acid, commonly known as cyanide, or something of equivalent potency. It appears to have been introduced into her tea unseen." He swallowed hard. "I have called for the contents of her cup and any remaining tea in the pot to be sent immediately for examination at the county lab. Then our poor." Mrs. Marwood realized the betrayal. Too late to name her killer, Miss Marple mused. She surveyed the guests, careful not to betray her thoughts. "We must assume, then, that someone among us had both motive and the opportunity to lace her cup before she drank, and if my deduction is correct, wrote the word murder only after she felt the poison's grip take hold." Mr. Ridley scoffed. "But who here would? There's no scandal brewing amongst us, surely." He puffed out his chest as though daring the crowd to accuse him. "I've known Mrs. Marwood for years. Always cordial, always quiet. The idea that one of us killed her is preposterous. You may find it so." Miss Marple replied gently, "Yet preposterous events do sometimes occur in the most genteel of settings." She noted Mr. Ridley's defensive posture, the slight flare of his nostrils, the tension at his shoulders. "Might I ask, Mr. Ridley, when you last saw Mrs. Marwood this morning?" He blinked, taken aback. I passed her by the rose arbor, round 10 o'clock, I think. She was sketching the new camellias." I nodded. She smiled, and that was that. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze moving to Colonel Haversham. "And you, Colonel, did you notice her this morning? Perhaps in the greenhouse?" The colonel straightened, clearing his throat. I did indeed. I dropped by to inquire about the poinsettias for next week's hunt. She assured me they would brighten the stands. She handled each stem with remarkable care. He paused. It was odd, however, that she seemed distracted. Her hands trembled, though I assumed the cold was to blame. Another slender thread. Miss Marple thanked him and pivoted to Mrs. Tilling. "And you, my dear, were you in the conservatory before the accident?" Mrs. Tilling pressed her lips together. "Yes, though only briefly. I fetched another cup of tea for Mrs. Harrow outside. When I returned, I heard the commotion. I arrived just in time to see Mrs. Marwood slump, but I did not see anyone slip anything into her cup." Miss Marple's mind catalogued each statement, mentally marking which accounts were vague and which precise. She watched as Lady Penrose approached her with timid steps. "Agatha, I don't mean to trouble you." Lady Penrose's voice trembled. Her fingers drummed anxiously on her pearl necklace. "But I must know. Do you think any of our friends here could be responsible?" Miss Marple took Lady Penrose's hand in hers. "I cannot say yet, my dear, but I promise you I shall find out. For now, let us consider the nature of her message. Writing in frost requires time and deliberation or considerable desperation, and it implies the killer did not want the death to appear natural." She smiled softly. "It is a profession, perhaps, in drawing attention to a crime without uttering a single word." A sudden murmur rose near the doorway. To newcomers had arrived Mr. Hargrave, Lady Penrose's elderly cousin, and Miss Ellis, the young governess from the rectory. Each wore expressions of shock as they took in the scene. Miss Marple greeted them with quiet courtesy. "I'm afraid we are in the midst of something rather grave," she said. "Please do not be alarmed. We are taking every precaution to understand what happened." As they joined the circle, Miss Marple observed the newcomers' demeanors, Mr. Hargrave's stooped posture and watery eyes, Miss Ellis's trembling fingers clutching her reticule, and the slight flush of curiosity on the face of Mr. Hargrave's companion, Mr. Alden, a solicitor from the neighboring market town who had come to review Lady Penrose's will. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple's instincts prickled. A solicitor at a garden party? Highly irregular scheduling. A potential clue. Yet she remained courteous. "Mr. Alden," she inquired, "it seems you were due to meet with Lady Penrose later. Did you notice anything amiss when you arrived?" Mr. Alden cleared his throat. "Actually, yes. The path leading to the greenhouse was slightly damp, almost as though someone had tracked dew inside. I thought it odd, given the floor's tiles are usually too warm to hold moisture this time of day." He swiveled to look at Colonel Haversham. "You did mention the frost was stubborn this morning." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She glanced down at the tiled floor, now dotted with faint wet footprints leading toward the bay window. "Very astute, Mr. Alden. Someone walked here recently, perhaps to write that message." She turned back to the circle. "There's much to consider: the footprints, the timing, the opportunity. And yet all of you have plausible explanations for your movements. Surely one of us must be lying." Mrs. Tilling whispered, eyes darting among the group. "Who among such polite company lies as steadily as a poisoner?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Ah, my dear, people lie constantly, haltingly, in small ways. Yet the greatest lies are often the ones we tell ourselves to justify an action, to conceal guilt. But in time, the truth reveals itself, much like frost melting under the sun." She offered Mrs. Tilling her handkerchief. "Let us be patient. Hasty judgments often lead to missteps." The villagers exchanged uneasy looks. Some nodded in agreement. Others pursed their lips, unsettled by Miss Marple's calm assurance. Outside, the greenhouse's glass panes winked in the morning light, oblivious to the moral frost within. Words like murder, poison, and foul play hovered in the warm air as the gentle hum of whispered. Theories began to swell into a chorus of suspicion. Miss Marple withdrew to a quiet corner of the conservatory. placing herself near the teapot and remaining cups silent witnesses to the dreadful crime. She bent close to study the delicate rim of the silver pot, noting minute flecks of residue that caught the light. Beyond her, the villagers formed clusters, trading glances, speculating in rapid undertones. Some clutched their teacups tighter. Others pressed lips against trembling teacups, as though willing the warmth to guard them against suspicion. Within that swirl of anxious activity, Miss Marple's thoughts raced along invisible conduits. Each snippet of dialogue, each tremor of a hand, each misplaced footprint was part of a larger design, a web spun from human frailty and hidden desires. She recalled Mrs. Marwood's final gasp, pointing to that fatal message. The murder was not just an act of violence, it was a message, a statement. The killer had intended the word murder to indict someone or something. But whom? As the village's gossipers and theorists vied for attention, Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself in the midst of chaos. She recalled the precise shape of the handwriting in frost, the uneven tilt of the M, the abrupt jags of the U, the slight smudge trailing the D. A tremor of recognition passed through her. This was not the writing of a stranger, but of someone unpracticed in script, a shaky hand, someone unaccustomed to leaving messages in this way. Her eyes opened. She would begin by retracing Mrs. Marwood's last steps, from the rose arbor to the teapot, and finally to the window where she had written out her warning. Only then could she gauge who had been nearest to the pots, whose lace-cuffed sleeve bore traces of frost, whose gloved fingertips might have slipped the poison into the cup undetected. The first whispers of accusation had begun to rise among the villagers. Mrs. Harrow's aside about Mr. Ridley's new gun, the vicar's quiet suspicion of financial motives, Lady Penrose's concern for her cousin Mr. Hargrave, all were possibilities, but nothing yet was proof. Miss Marple, unmoved by idle gossip, was resolved to follow the faintest clue, no matter how small. In this gentle village, beneath the veneer of warmth and propriety, lay dark secrets waiting to be awakened, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming smile and keen eye, would untangle them one by one, piecing together the truth until the entire picture stood clear. For now, the garden party's second dawn had broken not with laughter, but with dread, and the first seeds of suspicion had been sown. The real investigation, Miss Marple knew, was only just beginning. Chapter 3, Early Investigation. Midday sun climbed higher over Coldthorn Green, turning the conservatory windows into sheets of mercury that reflected the anxious faces within. Yet within the glass shelter, a chill still lingered, an echo of Mrs. Marwood's final, icy script that no one would soon forget. While Lady Penrose oversaw the discreet removal of the body, and Dr. Carter arranged the tea paraphernalia for forensic collection, Miss Marple slipped quietly away. She needed fresh air and space to think. Stepping into the crisp courtyard, Miss Marple paused by the fountain that marked the center of the garden. Its waters, dark from morning shade, rippled softly where a stray breeze disturbed the surface. She knelt at the edge, peering into the murky depths. The fountain was not part of today's crime scene, yet she knew its stone basin held the imprint of every shoe that had crossed the courtyard. Carefully, she traced the rim with a gloved finger until her eyes caught a slender, muddy footprint on the flagstone beside her, a footprint that had not been there when she passed this way earlier. It was too small for Colonel Haversham, too narrow for Mr. Ridley's stout brogues, and too neat for the governess's sensible lace-ups. Yet the pattern of the sole, a delicate scallop, was familiar. It belonged to Miss Alice, the young governess. Miss Marple stood and smoothed her lavender cardigan. She made note of the fresh print, silent as the morning frost that still clung to the greenhouse panes. A motive did not immediately present itself, but opportunity and action did. Miss Ellis had crossed here, behind the conservatory, at just the wrong moment. but that could mean nothing or everything. She tucked the thought away, determined to confirm it through conversation rather than assumption. Miss Marple's first destination was the greenhouse itself, a long, elegant building attached to the conservatory, housing Lady Penrose's prized collection of winter-blooming camellias and orchids. The heavy wooden door stood ajar, leaving a sliver of warm, humid air to escape into the courtyard. Inside, the glass roof was veined with frost that melted into beating droplets, raining gently onto the rich soil below. The pungent sweetness of damp earth and exotic petals calmed Miss Marple's mind. Sharpening her senses rather than dulling them, Lady Penrose was there, pacing between the rows of pots, her slippers leaving tiny, damp smudges on the stone floor. She paused at a camellia in full bloom, fingers trembling as she reached to adjust the supporting stick. "Agatha," Lady Penrose said in a low voice, hurried and breathless. "I can scarcely bear the thought that any of my friends would harm one another in my own home. But Mrs. Marwood, she was so dear to me." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her friend's arm. "People often hide their resentments, even from those they trust most. The very intimacy of a garden party can cloak deadly intentions." She swept a glance along the neat rows of saplings. "Tell me, my dear, when you last spoke to Mrs. Marwood this morning, did you notice her taking any particular interest in the greenhouse flowers?" Lady Penrose drew in a shaky breath. "Yes, actually. She was quite excited about the new camellia I purchased from London. She said she had an idea for a series of sketches to capture the way the petals unfurled in the greenhouse light. She asked for my permission to bring her sketchbook tomorrow. She wished to begin as soon as possible." Miss Marple nodded. "And did she mention any plans beyond spending time here?" She watched Lady Penrose's face for any sign of hesitation. "Only that she was pleased to have the peace of the greenhouse," Lady Penrose replied. I never dreamed it might become her final refuge." Miss Marple offered a condolent smile before turning to examine the camellia's petals. They were perfectly formed, pale as a moonlit veil, yet a faint bruise marked one side where a petal drooped unnaturally. She touched it lightly. A bruise can tell us of a careless hand, or one too eager in its attentions. Someone rushed past here, perhaps, or handled the plant too roughly. She stood upright, brushing the soil from her gloves. "Thank you, my dear." She left Lady Penrose to her grief and crossed to the opposite end of the greenhouse. Here stood Mr. Alden, the solicitor, his stern face illuminated by the soft light. He crouched near a low bench, holding a leather-bound letter in his hand. As Miss Marple approached, he closed the envelope with a snap that sounded too deliberate. "Mr. Alden," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "I did not expect to see you here. You mentioned earlier some damp footprints near the path. Have you observed anything else of interest?" He brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve. "Miss Marple, forgive me if I seem forward, but I find these proceedings most irregular. Your garden party turned into a crime scene overnight, and I arrived to review Lady Penrose's estate papers. Yet I discovered one document missing from my satchel." He held up the letter. "I found this tossed beneath the bench." He offered it to her. The envelope bore the crown seal of Lady Penrose's household. Miss Marple took the letter, noting that someone had hastily inserted it within a folder and misplaced the stack. "And whose writing is this?" she inquired as she turned it over. Alden shook his head. "I cannot say. I only know it was in the batch I brought. I must verify whether it contained any codicils to the will, perhaps altering beneficiaries. If someone wished to remove it, that could be motive enough." Miss Marple tucked the letter into her reticule. She did not wish to alert him to her suspicion, but the act of hiding a legal document was indeed telling. Perhaps Mrs. Marwood had discovered its absence and confronted the culprit, or perhaps the killer had acted to prevent her from revealing its contents. Either way, the missing letter demanded closer scrutiny. "Thank you, Mr. Alden," she said softly. "I shall keep this safe until we know more." Meanwhile, I will need your assistance later in questioning the guests about the estate papers." She gave a courteous nod and withdrew, leaving him to stare after her back in the courtyard. Miss Marple spotted Colonel Haversham standing near the fountain, arms crossed and gazing down at the same muddy footprint she had noted earlier. As she approached, he looked up, his face clouded with thought. "Colonel," she greeted him, "I'm glad to find you here. The doctor is sending samples of tea and residue to the lab. Did you notice anything unusual about the tea service this morning? Any awkward movements, extra hands, or perhaps a missing spoon?" The colonel placed a gauntleted finger to his temple. "Now that you mention it, yes. When I fetched my second cup, I saw Mrs. Harrow leaning close to Mrs. Marwood's teapot as though examining the spout. I thought it curious, but she is ever attentive to details. Perhaps she merely sought a clearer view of the floral emblem on the silver." Miss Marple glanced toward the house, where Mrs. Harrow stood conversing with the vicar. Mrs. Harrow's posture was impeccable, though her cheeks were flushed and her hands trembling ever so slightly. Miss Marple filed away the colonel's observation, a witness claim that Mrs. Harrow had been near the teapot at the critical moment. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. "Please keep me informed of anything else you recall." She moved on, traversing the courtyard toward a shaded alcove where Mrs. Harrow had just emerged, book clasped to her chest as if to shield her from the world. "Mrs. Harrow," Miss Marple called as she approached. "May I have a word?" The schoolmistress offered Miss Marple a polite nod and stepped aside. "Agatha, I cannot help feeling responsible. I was so engrossed in my literacy studies with the children that I hardly noticed Mrs. Marwood until it was too late." She swayed slightly, her grip on her book suffocating. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. "There is no blame to be hastily assigned. But tell me what drew you to the teapot moments before Mrs. Marwood collapsed." Mrs. Harrow's breath caught. I noticed a drop of tea on the rim, as though it had been freshly poured. I wanted to see if it matched the aroma of Mrs. Marwood's cup, in case she wished to refill. I did not think it suspicious. I simply admired the ornate crest. Miss Marple nodded. "And did you perceive any difference in taste or color?" The schoolmistress looked as though she might weep. "Yes, there was a faint bitterness, almost metallic. But I thought only that the kettle had left sediment in the spout. I washed the pot later, but by then she broke off." Miss Marple's heart tightened. Mrs. Harrow's detail about metallic bitterness suggested she had tasted the poison herself, though not enough to harm her. Did she realize what it was? And if so, why had she not mentioned it sooner? Miss Marple's mind raced with possibilities. Mrs. Harrow as a witness, Mrs. Harrow as a victim, Mrs. Harrow as the one who might have retrieved the missing letter. Each scenario required proof, not conjecture. "Thank you," Miss Marple said quietly. "Your courage in telling me this helps more than you know." As she withdrew, Miss Marple paused by a stone bench at the edge of the courtyard. There, half concealed by the low wall, lay a single white glove, its pair nowhere in sight. She picked it up, noting a faint smudge of soil on the cuff and a subtle scent of lavender that matched her own cardigan. This glove belonged to one of the ladies. Perhaps Mrs. Tilling, perhaps Miss Cromwell, perhaps Lady Penrose herself. Whoever removed it in haste had left a trace of their presence before she could examine it further. Footsteps approached. She slipped the glove into her pocket just as Miss Cromwell appeared, her eyes bright with tears and curiosity. "Miss Marple, there you are. Everyone is asking where you've gone off to," she exclaimed, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. "I thought I might find you in the garden. I wanted to ask, do you truly believe someone among us committed this terrible act?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I do, dear, though I do not yet know who. But I have learned much already. Footprints in the courtyard, tears of regret from those with secrets, a missing legal letter, a glove discarded in haste, and bitter tea tasted by none but a few. Each clue is a lantern in the fog. I simply must place them so the path to the truth is clear." Miss Cromwell nodded, wiping her eyes. "Is there anything I can do? Anything you need?" Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Yes, observe quietly, and tell me if anything seems out of place. Note, too, the smallest detail, a glance that lingers too long, a cough that sounds forced, a question asked in awkward tone. Human nature is rarely consistent under stress." Miss Cromwell bowed her head. "I will, Agatha. I will watch and listen." Miss Marple lingered for a moment, gazing across the courtyard where each suspect now circulated with forced calm. The greenhouse glimmered behind them, as though oblivious to the tragedy its warmth had witnessed. Somewhere in this gathering were hearts capable of murder, and hands skilled enough to poison a teacup, but also hearts innocent, hands trembling with grief. The sun climbed higher, and the morning's frost began to relinquish its grip on the world. The first drops fell from leaf to stone, marking the passage of time and the vanishing of cold. Within her modest gloves, Miss Marple felt a new resolve take hold. She would follow the footprints visible and invisible, until the identity of the killer was laid bare. For in Coldthorn Green, where gentility masked deception, it was only through patient observation and gentle questioning that truth could bloom. Like a camellia in frost, fragile but unyielding. And Miss Marple, with her unerring eye for human nature, would ensure it did. Chapter 4. First suspects. A low murmur drifted through the conservatory as the last droplets of frost slid from the glass panes, pooling at the base of the window where Mrs. Marwood had etched her final warning. The medical examiner's cart had long since departed, and a hush of expectancy settled among the remaining guests. It was in this charged silence that suspicion first found form. Coalescing around the familiar faces of Coldthorn Green. Miss Marple stood near the teapot display, studying the discarded cups and the faint residue that clung to their rims. She had requested privacy to inspect the pieces up close, but found herself joined by Colonel Haversham, Mr. Ridley, and Lady Penrose, each drawn by the pull of unanswered questions. "The weapon," Miss Marple murmured, swirling the remains of tea in a silver cup, "was something Mrs. Marwood could neither see nor taste until it was too late. We know it was placed in her cup before the party began, yet the opportunity must have been fleeting." Colonel Haversham eyed the teapot. If it was indeed the pot itself that carried the poison, then the culprit had to have handled it while no one watched. But everyone was in the drawing room or the rose arbor at that hour. He frowned. "Unless one of us sneaked away," Mr. Ridley snorted. "You speak of skulking about, Colonel. I doubt any respectable resident of this village would risk such a deed." He squared his broad shoulders. "Nevertheless, I can confirm I was nowhere near the teapot until after Mrs. Marwood collapsed." Lady Penrose laid a gentle hand on Mr. Ridley's arm. "Let us not jump on each other's defenses. We must, by all means, suspect, but with courtesy." She turned to Miss Marple. "Agatha, who do you think had the clearest chance to tamper with the tea?" Miss Marple considered. "We must examine those who moved between rooms before the party began, and those whose demeanor suggested more than idle curiosity." She paused, letting her gaze sweep the assembled guests. "I propose we begin with, for persons of interest, Mrs. Harrow, whose hand trembled over the spout; Mr. Alden, whose legal letter vanished; Miss Ellis, whose footprints led here; and of course, Lady Penrose's cousin, Mr. Hargrave, who arrived with surprising haste." Lady Penrose's expression tightened. "Agatha, do you truly suspect my cousin?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I suspect no one until we have evidence." But Mr. Hargrave's sudden appearance, combined with his proximity to the greenhouse door at the precise time, merits inquiry. As Miss Marple spoke, the party's remaining guests gathered around a central table. Mrs. Tilling fussed with her gloves. Miss Cromwell bit her lip, and the vicar exchanged uneasy glances with Colonel Haversham. Miss Marple invited the first suspect forward. "Mrs. Harrow," she said, addressing the schoolmistress, "you were near the teapot when the cups were first arranged. You tasted a drop and spoke of bitterness. Might you recall precisely when and how you did so?" Mrs. Harrow drew a quivering breath. She smoothed the front of her dress and began. I fetched a fresh cup for Miss Cromwell. As I poured, I noticed a small fleck at the lip of the pot, so I dabbed a fingertip to taste. It was sharp too sharp for tea." She clasped her hands. "I thought it was tarnished from the silver, so I rinsed the spout. I did not consider poison until I learned of Mrs. Marwood's death." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but probing. "Your action shows concern, but also that you knowingly handled the pot after potential contamination. If another guest wished to mask the act, they might encourage such rinsing to obscure evidence. Yet you came forward, which argues against guilt." A ripple of relief passed over Mrs. Harrow, though her eyes remained haunted. Miss Marple filed the exchange in her mind and turned to Mr. Alden. "Mr. Alden," she continued, "you arrived shortly before the party to discuss Lady Penrose's will. One of your documents went missing, and you found it here beneath a bench. Why might someone wish to remove such a letter?" The solicitor adjusted his pince-nez. "The will names several beneficiaries, including Mrs. Marwood, whose sketches were to be preserved in trust. If that codicil were removed, her heir would lose that bequest. I feared foul play until Mrs. Marwood's body was discovered." Miss Marple tapped a finger on the tabletop. "A motive related to inheritance, then. Did you confide to anyone that Mrs. Marwood stood to gain under the will?" Mr. Alden shook his head. "Only Lady Penrose and her solicitor, naturally." He hesitated. "I did mention it in passing to Colonel Haversham during a brief consultation on legal etiquette." Colonel Haversham clicked his tongue. "Indeed, we spoke of how trust funds are administered, but I confess no one else was party to that detail, least of all Mrs. Tilling, who seemed most anxious to gossip." Miss Marple pressed on. "Thank you, Mr. Alden. I will want to review the exact wording of that codicil presently." She turned, with a knowing glance, to Miss Ellis, who had lingered near the window. "Miss Ellis," Miss Marple said, "you were seen crossing the courtyard shortly before the message was written in frost. Your footprints betray your path. Might you explain your purpose?" The governess, slender and pale beneath her bonnet, swallowed and nodded. I came to fetch my gloves, which I had left near the greenhouse door." She pointed toward the low wall where the single glove lay. "When I arrived, I saw a group around Mrs. Marwood. I should have returned immediately, but something drew me back to the path." Her lips quivered. "I did not wish to disturb the party. By the time I realized, it was too late." Miss Marple observed her closely. "You say you returned to retrieve gloves, yet your footprints covered a wider area, near the teapot and the table as well. How many times did you pass through here?" Miss Ellis's eyes flickered. "3 times, perhaps. Once for my gloves, once back to the house, and once when I heard the cry." She pressed a hand to her chest. "I know it seems suspicious, but my only concern was etiquette. I feared causing a scene." Lady Penrose leaned forward. "Althea, Agatha is merely sorting details. Please do not be distressed." She glanced at Miss Marple, who smiled reassuringly at the governess. Miss Marple took a moment before addressing the final suspect, Mr. Hargrave, who stood near the roses with his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Hargrave," she said, "you arrived unexpectedly early today and were seen entering the greenhouse moments before the party began. You told me you came to admire the blooms, but do you deny any other purpose?" Mr. Hargrave's lined face betrayed annoyance. "I confess, I came to speak with Mrs. Marwood about a botanical illustration she executed for me last month. I have long admired her work and hoped she might frame it for my study." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "A noble aim. Yet why did you not join the others in the drawing room when the tea was served? Instead, you remained here until the very moment of her collapse. I was absorbed in conversation with her," he admitted. "I had intended to present her with a commission, but was surprised by the sudden commotion." He held up a trembling hand. "I would never harm her. She was one of the kindest people I have known." Miss Marple inclined her head, filing away his protest. Beneath his protestation, she sensed reluctance and undercurrent of something unspoken. Having questioned all four, Miss Marple requested privacy for a brief perusal of the greenhouse. Once alone, she examined the camellia with its bruised petal, then stepped back to view the teapot ensemble in full. She noted the positions of the cups, four plain bone china cups for regular guests, one ornate cup for Lady Penrose, and one diminutive cup for Mrs. Marwood. The small cup had been the victims, a detail she had nearly overlooked amid the larger drama. A theory began to form. Mrs. Marwood's cup was smaller, and thus easier to isolate. The killer had needed only to swap the regular cups with a poisoned one for her. But the arrangement risked detection. Someone might notice the misalignment of cup and saucer. The thief of a letter had also miscarried, dropping it near the bench. The fleeting tremor of Mrs. Harrow's hand, Mr. Alden's missing document, Miss Ellis's footprints, and Mr. Hargrave's timing wove together, though the pattern was not yet coherent. Exiting the greenhouse, Miss Marple found the suspects grouped in small clusters, exchanging guarded glances. The vicar approached her, his gaze grave. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "I fear the parish cannot rest until the culprit is named. Have you any sense of who it might be?" Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Not yet, Reverend, but I have learned enough to know that every motive hinted at here is genuine yet incomplete. Each of our four suspects holds a piece of the puzzle. The missing letter suggests monetary motive. The footprints suggest physical opportunity. The teapot taste suggests fortunate timing. And the greenhouse incident suggests premeditation." She guided the vicar toward Lady Penrose and her cousin. "Let us assemble the group. I will propose we reconvene in Lady Penrose's drawing room, where we may discuss our findings without interruption, and where each of us may speak freely of our whereabouts this morning." As they walked back toward the house, Miss Marple's mind whirred behind her gentle smile. She had laid bare the first suspects, yet none had cracked under pressure. The true killer remained hidden among them, someone capable of subtlety, deception, and patience. A murderer who, like frost, would leave only the faintest imprint and vanish before the warmth could detect it. Inside the drawing room, Miss Marple arranged the chairs in a semicircle, seating the four suspects at its center. The guests formed an outer ring, silent and watchful. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, gilding the edges of the furniture and casting elongated shadows. "Friends," Miss Marple began, "we have shared our observations, and each of you has provided an account of your actions. But there remains a crucial question. Why would someone choose to murder Mrs. Marwood in such a theatrical manner?" She paused, letting the question resonate. The word murder scrawled in frost was no accident. It was intended to ensure we knew, yet it was also a cry for justice, a statement against silence. Mr. Alden cleared his throat. "But why not a note? Why not a letter? Why risk handwriting in frost that would melt when discovered?" Miss Marple smiled. "Because the writer lacked paper and ink, and time. Frost was at hand and visible. It allowed the dying Mrs. Marwood to condemn her killer in a medium both impermanent and unavoidable." She turned to Mrs. Harrow. "You touched the spout, tasted the drop, and realized too late what it was. If you had suspected sooner, you might have prevented further tragedy." Mrs. Harrow bowed her head. "I wish I had." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Miss Ellis. "You retraced your steps 3 times and found your glove misplaced. You must have noticed something, anything that may further our understanding." Miss Ellis swallowed. I recall hearing Mr. Hargrave's voice raised in argument as I passed the greenhouse. It was too indistinct to make out words, but I thought it odd he seemed upset. Her eyes flicked toward Mr. Hargrave, whose mouth tightened Dotmer. Hargrave's voice was low and firm. I was simply discussing a price with his solicitor, Mr. Alden, regarding the botanical sketches. Nothing more heated than the cost of framing. Lady Penrose gasped. He lied to you? He borrowed my sketches without asking. Miss Marple steered them back. Let us remain calm, Mr. Ridley. You observed no one near the tea table, but might you have seen someone approach the greenhouse during the early preparations? Mr. Ridley scowled. I did see the vicar slip away, but assumed he sought quiet prayer. His gaze darted to the Reverend, who blinked in surprise. The vicar cleared his throat. I admit, I retired for a moment of reflection near the rose arbor. Yet I returned when I heard the crash of the teacup. Miss Marple folded her hands. Each of you moved through these spaces with plausible reasons. Yet we know the poison was delivered before the garden party began. Thus, the murderer had to handle the teapot or swap the victim's cup earlier. The message in frost was hastily composed, written with cold fingers. And we know Mrs. Marwood had strength enough to trace each letter. She rose and walked to the window. Who here can write in frost? Who has fingers numb enough from the cold yet bold enough to press glass? Who, in other words, is capable of combining knowledge of Mrs. Marwood's habits, the layout of the greenhouse, and the changing of the cups? Silence fell. Miss Marple turned, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. I have pointed to for suspects, but the truth lies not in what each hid from us, but in what each revealed. Later this evening, when the lab confirms the poison's identity, and when the county coroner's clerk arrives with the paperwork, I will gather everyone here once more. Then, and only then, will the smallest clue, overheard word, misplaced footprint, dropped letter, point definitively to our murderer. She paused, allowing her words to settle like dust in sunlight. Until that time, I ask all of you to remain in the house or its grounds. No one is under formal accusation, but the village must know that justice awaits with that. Miss Marple took her seat, her gentle smile masking the fierce intellect behind her eyes. Around her, the suspects shifted uneasily, each silently weighing the true identity of a killer who, like frost itself, had touched their lives with death before melting away, leaving behind only the faintest, most telling traces. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. The hush that followed Miss Marple's ultimatum lingered like a shadow. Across the drawing room, the heavy tapestry curtains were drawn against the dying winter light, leaving only the flicker of the lit candelabra to illuminate anxious faces. Outside, the crunch of boots on frosted gravel reminded those gathered that the world had not yet forgiven Cold Thorn Green for its unexpected descent into violence. Miss Marple sat at the head of the semicircle, its curve now half filled with uneasy suspects, and the rest with silent onlookers. Deep in thought, she traced the rim of her teacup, faintly stained by the last dregs of afternoon tea. In her palm, she felt the subtle indentations left by the silver handle, a detail she would recall later, for the shape corresponded almost exactly to a depression she had observed in Mrs. Marwood's own dainty cup. Before we proceed to further questions, Miss Marple began, her voice almost too soft to be heard at first. I would like to share an observation that emerged while I examined Mrs. Marwood's sketchbook and botanical samples. She stood and reached to the small side table where the book lay under a glass dome. Lifting the dome, she opened the sketchbook to a page marked by a pressed camellia petal. She carried this petal with her, having plucked it from Lady Penrose's prized camellia only this morning, Miss Marple said, pointing to the faded bloom. Yet if you recall, the camellia in the greenhouse, the one she admired most keenly, bore no sign of having been disturbed. Its petals were intact, though one was bruised. She tapped the sketchbook. which suggests someone else replaced the petal, someone who sought not only to study Mrs. Marwood's passion, but also to cloak their own intervention. A strained murmur rippled through the guests. Lady Penrose paled, glancing from the sketchbook to the greenhouse door as though uncertain which possessed the greater treachery. Colonel Haversham leaned forward, but met Miss Marple's glance and retreated with a curt nod. Miss Marple turned to Mr. Alden. "Mr. Alden, you spoke of a missing codicil relating to these very illustrations. Would you recognize this pressed bloom if you saw it among your documents?" The solicitor glanced at the petal, then at the page beneath. "That is indeed Mrs. Marwood's handiwork, none other," he said softly. "I recall the codicil specified that a set of her original watercolors, each depicting a camellia variant, be entrusted to her niece upon her passing." He swallowed. This petal, pressed into her sketchbook, served as a living reference. Whoever altered the will might have torn out pages, yet overlooked this loose specimen. Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. Yet the sketchbook remains untouched, petal included except for one curious anomaly." She turned the page to reveal a faint, almost imperceptible smudge of ink beneath the flower. "Notice here, a blot of purple ink, like a petal's shadow. Though there is no ink used in these botanical drawings," gasps emerged. Mrs. Harrow's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Ellis's eyes widened until they resembled saucers. Even Mr. Ridley straightened, as though physically rebuked by the implication. "Purple ink," Miss Marple continued, "would have come from Lady Penrose's writing desk. Her quills and inkpot sit daily upon her secretary in the drawing room. Yet on the day of the garden party, the inkpot was notably undisturbed, its surface unbroken by a pen. The smudge, then, suggests someone attempted to disguise a removed page by pressing down a petal, inadvertently transferring ink." Lady Penrose stammered, "My inkpot, why? I never noticed anyone drawing near it." Her fingers trembled. I only realized it was undisturbed when I returned from the greenhouse." Miss Marple's gaze widened with polite inquiry. "Did you, perhaps, ask Mrs. Marwood to retrieve something from the drawing room before the tea was served? A plate, a document, anything that would lead her to stand close to your desk?" Lady Penrose's lips quivered. She blinked back a tear. "She fetched my will papers earlier. I asked her to confirm a clause. We stood here, by the secretary, while she read over the parchment. We spoke of the framing of her illustrations, then of her botanical trust. After that, I escorted her to the greenhouse." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, grave smile. "Then Mrs. Marwood most likely realized her codicil had been removed. She pressed the petal onto the writing desk to test for disturbed ink, then set it in her sketchbook. That smear was her fingerprint on the crime, though no one noticed." Mr. Hargrave shifted in his seat. His voice was brittle. "But you still make no accusation. What is the significance of the smudge, if not to name the thief of my cousin's will?" Miss Marple turned to him. "It names someone who used both the greenhouse and the drawing room in intimate succession, someone familiar with both spaces, someone who knew Mrs. Marwood would carry that petal as she moved between them." She paused, then added, "But there is more." She walked to the fireplace and removed a small, leather-bound tome, Mrs. Marwood's personal diary, lent to her by Dr. Carter for safekeeping. Opening to the last entry, she read aloud in a steady voice, "I fear a shadow looms over Coldthorn Green. I have noticed strange glances from those I trusted most. Today, I shall show Miss Harper the secret of the camellias and entrust my botanical covenant to the ink of this house." She closed the book. "Notice the names, Miss Harper, not Mrs. Harrow, but Miss Ellis, whose given name is Althea Harper. A hidden reference, meant to direct her trust, but the killer replaced the petal to mask her movements between the drawing room and greenhouse. Hoping the diary entry would be overlooked, a silent shock passed through the group. Miss Ellis's face blanched. Colonel Haversham's brow furrowed. Mr. Ridley set his jaw. Lady Penrose pressed a trembling hand to her throat. Mrs. Harrow whispered, "Althea." As if awakening from a dream, Miss Marple folded her hands. "The hidden clue, my dear friends, lies in the petal and the diary. The scrupulous Mrs. Marwood used that petal both to test for tampering and to signal her confidant, Miss Harper Althea, to her suspicions. Yet the murderer anticipated this and erased the codicil, hoping the diary entry and petal would be dismissed as botanical flourish." Miss Ellis stepped forward, her voice shaking. "I was asked to retrieve a ribbon Mrs. Marwood believed lost among the papers. I saw the diary open on the desk and read that line, but I could not stop the next moments. She clutched a handkerchief. I begged her not to trust me, but then I followed her to the greenhouse to warn her. When I saw the bruised camellia and bottle resting by the pots, I pressed the petal to see if someone had used the inkpot. Then I fled." Gasps erupted. Lady Penrose covered her mouth. Mr. Hargrave sprang up. Colonel Haversham frowned. Miss Marple raised her hand, restoring order. "Thank you for your honesty, Althea. Your actions were those of a protector, not a poisoner. You uncovered the murderer's attempt at deception, though you feared implicating yourself by proximity." Miss Ellis sank back into her seat, tears brimming. Miss Marple turned to the rest. "We see, then, that the true culprit is someone who knew of Mrs. Marwood's trust in Althea, who sought to divert suspicion by targeting the inkpot yet overlooked the petal's secondary imprint. She allowed the moment to linger before concluding. With this hidden clue now revealed, we can narrow our suspicion to someone intimate with both the visual art and legal arrangements of Mrs. Marwood's life, someone who coveted her illustrations enough to alter her will, and who had the audacity to poison her for it." A quiet resolution descended. The dying winter light glowed faintly in the window panes, as though Stacy of the greenhouse's holly lights had found their way indoors. Each guest turned inward, recalling their own movements and motives. The hidden clue had shown a narrow beam of truth into the heart of Coldthorn Green and Miss Marple, her eyes bright with determination, prepared to follow that beam unerringly toward the final revelation. The next step would require a confrontation of hearts and testimonies, yet now, at least, the garden's frost had yielded one vital secret. Mrs. Marwood's botanical artistry had outwitted her murderer, leaving behind a single, purple-stained petal to guide the way. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The drawing room's air felt thick with tension, as if the very tapestries and polished mahogany sensed the gathering storm of revelations. Miss Marple, seated at the center of the semicircle, had just unveiled the hidden clue of the purple inked petal and Mrs. Marwood's last diary entry. Around her, the faces of Coldthorn Green's most upstanding citizens were etched with shock, guilt, and determination. Now came the moment when masks would slip and true intentions show themselves. Miss Marple rose gracefully, smoothing the folds of her lavender cardigan. "Now that we possess the knowledge of Mrs. Marwood's final suspicions, and the evidence that her will was tampered with, it is time to revisit each of you. Let us speak plainly, recalling not only where you were, but why you might seek to alter her legacy." She began with Lady Penrose, whose gentle composure had become brittle. "My dear Lady Penrose, you and Mrs. Marwood shared a deep affection. Her botanical artistry brought warmth to your greenhouse on the coldest days. Yet if someone removed the codicil, they must have believed it served them better, that Mrs. Marwood did not benefit. Would you care to explain why anyone in this house might wish to deny her that legacy?" Lady Penrose's hands trembled as she clasped her pearl necklace. "Agatha, I can think of no one save perhaps my cousin Theodore. He was the one most displeased to learn that Mrs. Marwood's niece stood to inherit those sketches." She glanced at Mr. Hargrave, whose lip curled in a cold half-smile. "But I would never dream of harming Agatha Theodore. That is on my behalf." She turned to Miss Marple, eyes wide. "I begged him, after you discovered the missing letter, to confess if he had meddled. He promised he had merely borrowed the document to examine the terms, then returned it. Miss Marple nodded, though she noted Lady Penrose's slow blink and the slight quiver at her voice's end. Borrowing documents without record can lead to misunderstandings. Yet the only person who stood to lose by the codicil was Mr. Hargrave. She allowed the suggestion to linger before moving on. The focus shifted to Mr. Hargrave. Seated stiffly beside the vicar, Mr. Hargrave, you have admitted visiting Mrs. Marwood to commission her work. Yet you arrived early, lingered in both the drawing room and greenhouse, and your cousin suggests you took the codicil. Tell us truly, did you alter the will, and if not, why did you handle those papers unaccompanied? He inhaled deeply, settling back as though bracing for impact. I did examine the codicil, nay, I confess I handled it, but only to verify that the botanical trust named by my cousin's will was not excessive, or impugning other beneficiaries' rights. I intended to return it immediately. When I discovered it missing, I panicked and searched for it. I did not want scandal on this fine occasion. He swept his hand through thinning hair. I had no desire to kill Mrs. Marwood, only to protect our family's reputation. Miss Marple's eyes met his steadily. Panic can drive a person to hide their actions, but can it drive a person to poison? We know the poison was administered before the party began, and the codicil was removed in the same time frame. You had every opportunity, and motive, though a social motive rather than a personal one. Yet you claim no hand in murder. He clenched his fists. I swear, and may God judge me, that I did not poison her. My disgrace, perhaps, but not her death. Miss Marple let his words hang. She then turned to Colonel Haversham, who had until now remained silent. Being a military man, he had spoken little of emotion or inheritance. Colonel, you remarked on Mrs. Harrow's proximity to the teapot and confided in Mr. Alden about legal etiquette, yet you also hinted at observing someone leave the drawing room. Whom did you see, and what exactly did you overhear? The colonel cleared his throat, glancing at Mrs. Harrow and Miss Ellis before addressing Miss Marple. I noted Miss Harrow leaning over the spout, and I observed you, Miss Marple, checking residue. But I cannot say I saw the act of poisoning. What I did witness was Mr. Alden's agitation when the letter went missing, and later, the vigor with which Miss Ellis retrieved her gloves and fled. Miss Marple inclined her head. So, your testimony concerns to potential culprits, not yourself. She pivoted. Yet you also have personal stakes in this matter, as a man of honor. You would not want a symbol of civility, a garden party tainted by murder. Did you, perhaps, fear that Mrs. Marwood was about to expose someone close to you? The colonel's jaw tightened. My concern was only for the victim. Yes, I fear for a village's reputation, but I would not harm one to preserve another's standing. He sniffed, then added quietly, unless the one who stood to lose most was myself. A murmur rippled. Miss Marple met his gaze. Indeed, we do not yet know whose secrets are deepest, but we now have witnesses to their movements, and all four suspects have overlapping motives: inheritance, reputation, gratitude, and reputation once more. Miss Marple sank into her chair and beckoned Mrs. Harrow to step forward. Mrs. Harrow, you confessed to tasting the teapot's residue and believing it mere sediment. Yet you also admitted to gleaning the metallic bitterness of poison. What did you do with that knowledge? Mrs. Harrow's cheeks glowed with shame. I confess, I was so shocked I did nothing. I dried the pot, hoping to protect you all from suspicion. I feared telling Lady Penrose or the vicar would cause panic before Mrs. Marwood spoke her warning. By the time the message appeared, I was paralyzed with guilt. She pressed a trembling hand to her breast. I would have warned her, but I was ashamed of my own negligence. Miss Marple regarded her with gentle concern. Your silence, though forgiven in part, allowed the crime to proceed. Yet you lacked opportunity to administer the poison yourself unless you spiked the pot earlier. Before Mrs. Marwood's cup was filled, Mrs. Harrow's eyes widened in horror. "No, no, Agatha, I would never." She took a step back, pale as the frost that still clung to the greenhouse windows. Miss Marple smiled sympathetically and turned her attention to Mr. Alden. "And you, Mr. Alden, beyond the missing letter, you were keen to secure Lady Penrose's legal affairs. Did you fear Mrs. Marwood would challenge your legal expertise, thus prompting you to remove the codicil and perhaps more?" Mr. Alden's hand shook as he adjusted his pince-nez. "You impugn me unfairly, Miss Marple. I found the codicil worrying only because it bound Lady Penrose's funds. I feared that her generous trust would bankrupt the estate and cause scandal. I removed the codicil to review its wording, intending to restore it once assured. Yet I admit, I did not wish Mrs. Marwood knowledge of my meddling, though I would never harm her for it." He swallowed and continued, voice tight. "I was not present when the tea was served. I did not handle the cups. My expertise is law, not chemistry." He glanced at the vicar. "Surely none here would believe I had knowledge to procure cyanide." Miss Marple's gaze narrowed. "Cyanide can be obtained via multiple means, Mr. Alden, through horticultural sources even." She paused, but let us hold that thought. She stood and placed a hand on each armrest of her chair. "Gentlefolk, each of our first suspects appears sincere in their denials. Yet sincerity alone does not equate to innocence. We must delve deeper into the secrets that fester behind genteel facadas." She walked to the window, pulling back the heavy drapes for a moment to watch the faint sheen of dusk. Beyond the glass, the greenhouse stood silent, as though awaiting its next victim. Returning, Miss Marple addressed the group. "Who among you has further reason to fear Mrs. Marwood's discoveries? Who in the days prior might have sensed her suspicions and acted to silence her?" A tense stillness ensued. Colonel Haversham's gaze flicked to Miss Ellis, who sat rigid, tears trailing down her cheeks. Mr. Hargrave chewed his lip. Lady Penrose stared at her shaking hands, and Mrs. Harrow trembled, her eyes downcast. Miss Marple's stare pierced each in turn, noting the slightest flinch, the subtlest twitch. She inhaled slowly, then spoke once more. "There was another secret, overlooked until now. Mrs. Marwood's botanical samples, herbarium sheets and pressed petals, were to be donated to the county museum. Yet among her papers, I found draft correspondence and signed indicating you, Colonel Haversham, had offered to purchase her entire collection for private display." She looked at him. "You desired exclusivity, Colonel, and stood to profit from depriving the public of her work." The Colonel's face paled. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He drew a shuddering breath. I did propose purchasing the collection, but only at fair market value. I thought I could preserve it for posterity. I did not wish her dead." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Intent does not always distinguish itself from action. But that, too, remains in question." She addressed Mr. Hargrave next. "You, too, coveted her artistry enough to remove the codicil ensuring her niece gained possession. Yet you insisted your motive was familial concern." Mr. Hargrave's hands tightened in his lap. "I cared only for the sketches themselves, not for her demise." He paused, then added in a low voice, "I confess I thought of keeping them for my private study, but I did not expect her peril." Miss Marple eyed Lady Penrose. "And you, my dear, felt the sting of betrayal at a missing codicil but hastened to blame your cousin. Did you consider confronting Mrs. Marwood yourself or asking her to stay away from certain rooms?" Lady Penrose's eyes glistened. She bit her lip. I did ask her not to discuss the terms in front of guests. I feared gossip, but I never forbade her to enter any part of my home." Miss Marple took a breath and turned to Miss Ellis. "Althea, you overheard your namesake whispered in the diary's pages, and you acted to protect Mrs. Marwood. Yet in doing so, you crossed the very spaces Mrs. Marwood traversed. You discovered the bruise on the camellia and found the bottle. You then tested the pedal in the drawing room and fled. But what did you see near the bench that afternoon? I noted a faint smear of green on your gloved fingertips. Miss Ellis blinked back more tears. I saw Mrs. Marwood examining a bottle behind the pots. It had a green label, half hidden by leaves. She dabbed at her glove. I touched the leaf and on my glove remained a smear. She met Miss Marple's eyes. I did not know what it was until now, but it must have been her poison. A collective gasp filled the room. The vicar murmured a prayer. Miss Marple's expression remained calm but resolute. The green label indicates aconite, wolfsbane, a plant poison as deadly as cyanide. Mrs. Marwood must have found both an old supply of cyanide and a botanical tincture of aconite, suggesting long-planned intent by someone versed in both chemistry and botany. She clasped her hands. We see, then, the killer possessed knowledge of both horticulture and legal documents new to remove the codicil, and to mask their intervention with Mrs. Marwood's own research. Who among us fits that profile? For a moment, no one spoke. Each suspect's gaze shuddered away, but Miss Marple's steady stare did not relent. At last, she spoke in a low voice. I ask you all to consider who among you prized botanical secrets above friendship, legal contracts above conscience, and vengeance above mercy. When next we convene, I shall call upon the one who can no longer conceal their guilt, for their own conscience will betray them. Silence reigned as the dying light faded, leaving only the glow of the candelabra. One by one, the guests rose to leave faces etched with uncertainty, secrets churning behind polite masks. Only Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze thoughtful, her mind weaving the final threads that would bind motive, means, and opportunity into the tapestry of truth. In the hush, she heard the faint drip of melting frost from the greenhouse, a reminder that, however patient the killer, justice would come when the final drop fell. Chapter 7. Another twist. Late that evening, as gaslights flickered through the mullioned windows of Coldthorn Green Manor, a new disturbance shattered the uneasy calm. Miss Marple had retired to her guest chamber adjoining the drawing room. Intent on reviewing her notes by lamplight, she laid out the sketchbook, diary, and the purple-stained petal on her writing table, arranging each clue in careful order. Yet before she could sink into reflection, a faint tapping sounded at her door, 3 deliberate raps, as though a visitor sought urgent audience. Rising, Miss Marple opened the door to find Dr. Carter standing on the landing, his face ashen and his coat dusted with frost. Agatha, he whispered, there has been another incident. Mr. Hargrave, he's collapsed in the greenhouse. His voice trembled, apparently after drinking some tea. But it was a different cup. Alarm spiked through Miss Marple. She fetched her shawl and followed Dr. Carter down the corridor, past the drawing room where the 4 suspects had been gathered. In the conservatory, the maid was kneeling beside Mr. Hargrave, who lay unconscious on the cushioned divan, his lips stained pale, eyes closed, and breathing shallow. A silver teacup stood on the table, its contents half drunk, steam curling into the night air. Colonel Haversham and Lady Penrose arrived moments later, rushing to the side of her cousin. He said he felt dizzy, the colonel explained, kneeling to steady the solicitor's head. He asked for tea to soothe his nerves after today's revelations and took this cup. I filled it for him at the pot. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the teapot on the adjacent stand, its spout clean and wet. She nodded to Dr. Carter, who tested Mr. Hargrave's wrist for a pulse. His pulse is weak but present. I believe it is a mild dose, enough to incapacitate, not kill. But shocking, nonetheless. Lady Penrose's hands flew to her face. Good heavens! Another attempt at murder? Agatha, who would dare? She looked around at the few remaining guests, Mrs. Harrow, Miss Ellis, Colonel Haversham, and Mr. Ridley, all frozen and shocked. Miss Marple knelt beside Mr. Hargrave, She lifted the teacup, examined its rim. A faint emerald green smudge marked its inner lip the hue of aconite tincture. He has been poisoned with the same botanical extract Mrs. Marwood found among her specimens. Only a smaller dose to incapacitate rather than kill. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the scented air of orchids and camellias around them. Standing, Miss Marple addressed the onlookers. This twist confirms the murderer's determination not merely to silence Mrs. Marwood, but to neutralize anyone who might piece together the deception. Mr. Hargrave discovered too much, perhaps the continued existence of the codicil or the location of the botanical tincture, and thus was targeted. She paused, then continued. The murderer has access not only to Mrs. Marwood's botanical supplies, but also to the tea service itself, a calculated move to strike behind the guise of hospitality. Colonel Haversham pressed a hand to his mouth. But who could risk attacking another before they have tied up all loose ends? This suggests a frantic desperation. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. We must assume the killer believed Mr. Hargrave's knowledge posed a grave threat. Yet the attempt here, in the greenhouse, used the common teacup shared among the terrariums one seldom employed, but familiar to those who frequented the plants. She pointed to the small alcove where rare specimens sat under glass. Who among us habitually walks these paths, selecting that precise cup? And who knows the difference in cups reserved for Lady Penrose, for Mrs. Marwood, and for visitors like Mr. Hargrave? A silence fell so complete that the distant hoot of an owl sounded thunderous. All eyes turned to Miss Ellis, who had lingered near the fern stand, horrified tears tracing her cheeks. Mrs. Harrow clutched her handkerchief, and Mr. Ridley's mustache trembled. Colonel Haversham's face was a mask of stunned disbelief. Lady Penrose trembled, her pearls rattling softly. Miss Marple met their gazes in turn. We have witnessed two attempts, one fatal, one merely injurious, using botanical poisons. Each dose corresponded to a victim's size: cyanide for the frail Mrs. Marwood, and aconite for the larger frame of Mr. Hargrave. The first, a message of death; the second, a warning shot to those who would follow. This murderer is precise, knowledgeable, and ruthless. She waited, letting the weight of her words settle. Then, turning to Colonel Haversham, she asked gently, "Colonel, might you recall who handled this particular teapot last, before you refilled Mr. Hargrave's cup?" The colonel swallowed. I did, Agatha. I cleaned and refilled the pot for my guests, but only after Lady Penrose had asked me to clear the earlier service. I was unaware of the required botanical cups, and I cannot say how the crop of cups was arranged thereafter. I simply poured and passed. Miss Marple looked at the teapot's arrangement. 5 ordinary cups around its base, those of Mr. Ridley, Colonel Haversham, Mrs. Harrow, Miss Cromwell, and Miss Ellis, and 1 diminutive cup Mrs. Marwood alone had used earlier. Now, a 7th cup stood alone on a side table, meant for Mr. Hargrave. Its design matched neither the ordinary china nor the ornate family crest, an unfamiliar piece. This cup was not part of the main service, Miss Marple observed. It belonged to the greenhouse set, placed there for impromptu visitors. Whoever selected it knew both its location and the protocol for offering it to a guest. She turned to Lady Penrose. "You would not have requested this cup for Mr. Hargrave?" Lady Penrose shook her head. "No, I insisted only on his comfort, and asked the colonel to offer a cup from the drawing room if preferred. I knew nothing of the greenhouse service. I would never propose risking contamination twice." Miss Marple's gaze moved to Miss Ellis. "Althea, you frequented the greenhouse to check on the plants and to warn Mrs. Marwood. You are familiar with that set?" Miss Ellis's eyes widened. "Yes, I used one of those cups this afternoon when I fetched my gloves. I drank tea from it then, but I rinsed it afterward, not knowing it had been used for my sketching sessions." She shuddered. "I never thought to warn others. It was only afterward I realized the danger." Miss Marple inclined her head. Your familiarity, then, permitted you to handle that cup undetected. Yet your actions saved you from a lethal dose. The killer may have assumed it was reserved for still uninterested visitors. She paused. But what of the others? Who else handles these cups regularly? Mrs. Harrow shook her head. Never may I stay with my tea in the drawing room. I would not venture so far. Mr. Ridley furrowed his brow. I have no fondness for greenhouse tea. I always stick to my pheasant shooting club, where we use even stouter mugs. Miss Marple considered each denial. Then, stepping closer to the unconscious Mr. Hargrave, she lowered her voice. We have two attempts, one to kill, one to intimidate, both executed with botanical extracts. The murderer will strike again if we continue investigating. We must not allow another victim. She turned to the group. Therefore, I propose we secure both the drawing room and the greenhouse set separately. Observe who attempts to approach them, and thus reveal our assailant. Lady Penrose nodded. Yes, let us guard these places. She lifted her candle. I will station a servant here. Each of you will remain under gentle watch, and we shall reconvene at dawn. Colonel Haversham helped Mr. Hargrave to a nearby chaise longue, while Mrs. Harrow and Miss Ellis stood sentinel by the drawing-room door. Mr. Ridley volunteered to escort the butler to the kitchens. Miss Marple, remaining near the greenhouse doorway, exchanged a look with Lady Penrose, a tacit agreement to maintain vigilance. As they dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the hush, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities. The second attempt had narrowed the field. The killer must possess botanical acumen, knowledge of the teacup sets, and unsparing resolve. Only a handful remained plausible. And now, with the drawing room and greenhouse under watch, the next move would be theirs, an inevitable step toward exposure. Outside, moonlight danced on frost-glazed leaves. Within, shadows lengthened across tessellated tiles. A new night had fallen upon Coldthorn Green, bringing with it the promise of revelation or of further peril. Miss Marple, her keen eyes flickering in the lamplight, steeled herself for the coming hours. For at dawn, the final twist would unfold and the truth would emerge at last. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final tussle through the long night. The manor remained under a hushed and vigilant guard. Lady Penrose's butler, Mr. Jennings, kept watch in the drawing-room, his posture as straight as the polished mahogany of the furniture he tended. Mrs. Harrow and Miss Ellis alternated shifts by the door, their pale faces lit by flickering candlelight, while Colonel Haversham and Mr. Ridley patrolled the greenhouse in pairs. Every so often, Miss Marple exchanged a brief nod with Lady Penrose or Dr. Carter, each aware that the next few hours would determine whether the murderer would strike again, or finally reveal themselves. Miss Marple spent most of the vigil in her former quarters, seated at her writing table beneath the soft glow of a shaded lamp. The clues lay before her: the sketchbook with its purple smudged petal, the diary with its hidden reference to Althea Harper, the bruised camellia, the missing codicil, and the two poisoned cups, one fatal, one meant to incapacitate. Yet it was not only evidence she required. It was a confession, or at least a moment of weakness from the true culprit. She needed a psychological gambit to draw out the killer, and this room, with its intimate privacy and the lingering scent of Earl Grey, provided the perfect stage. Sometime after midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the corridor, a deliberate, measured tread that did not belong to the tired guards. Rising, she drew aside the curtain at her window and peered into the shadowed grounds. There, in the courtyard's pale moonlight, Miss Cromwell slipped from the side door of the drawing-room and moved toward the greenhouse, her cloak drawn tightly. She paused at the fountain, her breath visible in the chill air, then continued on without hesitation. That Miss Marple's heart quickened. She put on her shawl and followed, quietly opening her chamber door and closing it behind her. The corridor was silent except for her own footsteps. Past the drawing room, she saw Mr. Jennings seated in the gloom, eyes heavy with fatigue. His head bowed. He might have slept, but for the occasional soft murmur as if he dreamt aloud. Miss Marple made her way past him, careful not to disturb the butler's dignity. At the conservatory's side door, she slipped inside, greeted by the scent of damp earth and orchids. The greenhouse was dark, save for a single lamp left burning on a low table. Beside it stood Miss Cromwell, who muttered to herself, "If only I had spoken up sooner. If only I had told her." She lifted a hand to her throat as though to feel a pulse that was no longer there. Miss Marple stepped forward. "My dear, I could not let you wander these gardens alone." Her tone was soft but edged with authority. Miss Cromwell started, her hands dropping at her sides. "Agatha, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you," she swallowed. I thought I might see the petal again, to remind myself of her courage." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "Of course, Mrs. Marwood's courage is never far from our hearts." She moved to the table and picked up the glass dome enclosing the sketchbook. Lifting it, she placed it on the table before Miss Cromwell. "Would you care to look once more?" Miss Cromwell glanced at the delicate pages, then back to Miss Marple. Yes, please." She stepped forward, and the lamp's light fell on her face, a face drawn with lines of anxiety. "I've acted so strangely all day. I feared the killer would find me next." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "That fear is understandable." She leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I trust you, dear. Tell me, what did you see in these pages that drove you to the greenhouse tonight?" Miss Cromwell's lower lip trembled. She pressed both hands to her chest. "I saw the entry about me, Althea Harper, and the petal with its ink stain. I realized how close Mrs. Marwood came to exposing the killer. I feared that if I did not guard her secret, they might strike at me next." She looked down at the small table. "I thought if I stayed here by the plants, I might somehow be able to hide them, the sketchbook, the diary, away from prying eyes." Miss Marple's eyes shone with understanding. "Such loyalty touches my heart, my dear." She laid a comforting hand on Miss Cromwell's shoulder. "But you must trust that I will protect these clues. Your role tonight was to testify, not to hide evidence. You have done enough." She paused, her gaze drifting to the lamp's brass base. "Yet I cannot help but notice something curious. The lampstand bears a slight smear of green. On its edge." Miss Cromwell blinked. "Green dough. Yes, I leaned against it earlier when I thought I heard someone approaching." She traced a slender finger along the brass rim, dislodging a faint fleck. "It came from the leaf I touched. There were traces of that poison on it." Miss Marple watched intently. "Precisely. But you see, my dear, while you sought to protect Mrs. Marwood's legacy, the true murderer will use that green smear to frame your innocence if they can find you here." She stepped back, letting Miss Cromwell absorb the revelation. "Now, I will speak plainly. I have set this test for the killer. I left this light burning, knowing they would come this way if they believed their cover was about to be blown." Miss Cromwell gasped softly. "You anticipated them returning here? But why?" Miss Marple's lips curved. "Because the killer, desperate to destroy evidence, must ensure that neither sketchbook nor diary remains. And all the while, they must maintain the illusion of innocence." She wrapped her shawl about her shoulders. "Miss Cromwell, you should return indoors and leave the protection of these clues to me and Dr. Carter. You must rest." Miss Cromwell nodded, though her eyes were wide with relief and residual fear. "Thank you, Agatha. I will." As Miss Cromwell turned to leave, Miss Marple slipped out of the greenhouse and closed the door softly behind them. She paused to listen. No footsteps echoed. No rustle of fabric betrayed pursuit. The manor was still, save for the distant tick of a clock. Miss Marple retraced her steps to her chamber, then to the drawing room. Mr. Jennings's head drooped lower, and Miss Harrow's vigil remained steadfast beside the door. The household slept or pretended to, yet in her heart, Miss Marple knew the final test had been set. When the killer believed all evidence hidden, it would move once more. She returned to her room and slipped the lamp's shade back into place. On the table lay her assembled clues. She fingered the pressed petal, then the diary, then the sketchbook. All the pieces were ready. Only the killer's confession remained absent. Night deepened. Miss Marple, seated at her desk, wrote in her notebook, "The final act will be performed in the stillness before dawn. The murderer, believing the evidence secured, will seek to destroy the sketchbook and diary. Their intrusion will reveal fingerprints, footprints, or at least the telltale slipper mark that has eluded me thus far. I shall be waiting." She closed her notebook, extinguished the candle, and replaced it in its sconce. Then, with the softest whisper of movement, she withdrew to the doorway, sinking silently behind the curtain that cloaked the entrance to her room. There, she watched the dark corridor and the drawing room beyond, her keen eyes alert for the slightest stir. Time crawled toward dawn. The mantles held their breath, and in that pregnant stillness, only one thing was certain. Soon, the murderer would play their final card, and Miss Marple, in the quiet of Coldthorn Green Manor, would be ready to catch it in her gentle yet unerring grasp. Chapter 9. The revealed first pale fingers of dawn crept through the drawing room windows, brushing the polished floorboards with a timid glow. Miss Marple, still ensconced behind the curtain of her guest chamber, felt the tension coalesce like mist in the cool air. Her breath, silent and measured, mingled with the hush of anticipation. All night she had waited, listening for the faintest stir of footsteps, the telltale sign of a murderer, desperate to erase the final fragments of truth. At length, she heard it, a soft creak of the corridor floor, so delicate it might have been a mouse. She slipped from her hiding place, shawl wrapped tightly against the chill, and edged toward the doorway. There, in the dim half-light, stood Mr. Hargrave, his silhouette rigid with purpose, clutching a small matchbox in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other. Miss Marple stepped into view. "Good morning, Mr. Hargrave," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of one who knows every secret. He started, dropping the matchbox, a single match skittering across the carpet. He turned, pale as the frost-tipped roses outside. "Miss Marple," he gasped. I thought I was alone." "Hardly," she replied. "I trust your night's vigil has been restful." He swallowed, eyes darting to the papers. "I came to secure the will codicil, to remake it in honor of Mrs. Marwood's memory." His hands trembled as he held the papers aloft. "I could not allow it to be read by amateurs. It needed proper attention." Miss Marple's gaze settled on the small matchbox, lying open on the floor. Inside, a solitary match bore a notch of green along its tip. She retrieved it with gentle fingers. "Aconite tincture," she noted, holding the matchlight to the early glow. "You intended to burn the diary and sketchbook, I presume, using these matches to light the fire." His face crumpled. Yes. She was going to leave her niece everything, and then the world would forget me and my own passion for her art. He lifted the papers with a shaking hand. I thought if I destroyed the evidence tonight, I could restore the codicil tomorrow, quietly, and no one need know." Miss Marple nodded, stepping forward. "Your motive is clear now. Envy of Mrs. Marwood's botanical artistry, combined with wounded pride at being mentioned only as a beneficiary of her sketches, not their owner." She paused, then produced the pressed petal from her reticule. But Mrs. Marwood was no ordinary victim. In her final hours, she pressed this very petal onto Lady Penrose's inkpot to test for tampering and left behind the smear of purple you see. She knew to use physical evidence as her message. Mr. Hargrave looked at the petal, memory dawning in his eyes. She pressed it to see if the ink was fresh. Miss Marple held up his gaze. "Precisely. And the bruise on the camellia in the greenhouse, did you notice how it aligned with the petals on the bench where you stood earlier today. She drew a small sketch from her notebook, the camellia's shape, the bruise's arc, the broken stem. You handled the plant roughly when you retrieved the bottle of cyanide from among the pots. A shudder passed through him. I meant only to slip her a dose small enough to frighten her. But the cyanide in the teapot cup was too much, far too much. He covered his face with both hands. I panicked when she managed to write murder in frost. I never intended her to die. Miss Marple's expression was grave. Intent and outcome diverged tragically. You slipped cyanide into Mrs. Marwood's teapot before she poured her own cup, knowing she preferred the smaller, dainty cup designated for her. Then when you learned that Mr. Mrs. Marwood's niece's namesake, Miss Ellis had uncovered your tampering, you attempted a second strike with aconite to silence anyone who might expose you. He hung his head. I saw Colonel Haversham and Miss Ellis by the fountain. Her footprints matched the narrow sole that led to the greenhouse. I feared they had discovered the bottle, so I poured aconite into the greenhouse cup, believing it would only incapacitate, and planned to destroy the sketchbook before morning. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And so you chose to conceal your crime in darkness, trusting your knowledge of both poisons and horticulture to spare you detection. Yet you overlooked the simplest truth. Human nature leaves traces. The matchbox smear, your footprints on the greenhouse tiles, the letter you failed to return to Mr. Alden's satchel, and the purple ink blot each spoke louder than your denials. He closed his eyes, shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, Agatha. I never wished to kill two people. I only wanted what Mrs. Marwood's art represented: beauty, immortality. And I believed that by removing her legal claim and silencing her, I might preserve her work for myself. Miss Marple inclined her head. You have spoken the truth now, Theodore. You will face the consequences of your actions. But know that Mrs. Marwood's courage in etching her accusation into frost, and her intelligence in planting that petal, ensured that justice would follow. Even through the coldest of nights, she stepped back, allowing Colonel Haversham, who had silently entered behind her, to approach. The colonel produced a pair of gloves. I shall place him under arrest, Miss Marple. The authorities will be notified, and he will be taken into custody. Mr. Hargrave lifted his head, meeting Miss Marple's eyes with a hollow stare. I deserve it. He offered no resistance as the colonel took hold of his arm. Miss Marple turned to Lady Penrose, who had joined them, her face pale but relieved. My dear, the codicil will be restored, as Mrs. Marwood intended. Her legacy, her art, and her trust will remain intact. Lady Penrose laid a gentle hand on Miss Marple's arm. Thank you, Agatha. You have done what none of us could. Miss Marple smiled softly. Mrs. Marwood did most of the work herself. It was she who fashioned clues fit for a detective's mind. I merely followed her breadcrumbs as the first patrolman arrived to escort Mr. Hargrave. Miss Marple gathered the sketchbook, diary, and pressed petal. She placed them carefully into Lady Penrose's hands. Keep these safe until the inquest, please. They are the heart of the matter. Lady Penrose pressed the items to her chest. They shall rest in my study, where no ill intent can reach them. Miss Marple surveyed the assembled group: Colonel Haversham, Miss Ellis, Mrs. Harrow, Mr. Ridley, and the now detained Mr. Hargrave. Each bore relief mingled with sorrow. No one spoke. The weight of the night's events pressed down upon them. Finally, Miss Marple cleared her throat. Let us move indoors. The house must be restored to its proper order, and the villagers must be given time to absorb what has transpired. Tomorrow, the inquest will convene, and all these accounts will be given under oath. Lady Penrose offered her arm, and together they walked back toward the drawing room, leaving Colonel Haversham to lead her cousin away. As they passed beneath the lamp's glow, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment's reflection. The frost-etched word, the stained petal, the bruised bloom, the missing letter. the smeared matchbox all signs of human frailty and determination. Inside the drawing room, the butler stirred from his half-sleep, and Mrs. Harrow and Miss Ellis lowered their watchful vigil. A new day had begun, one that would bring both clarity and sorrow. Yet through it all, Miss Marple knew that justice had been served not by force or accusation, but by the gentle unspooling of truth, as intricate and beautiful as Mrs. Marwood's own botanical illustrations. And in that truth lay the answer to the question of murder at Coldthorn Green. It was not merely the act of a jealous mind, but the culmination of concealed resentments and thwarted passions, laid bare by a woman who refused to die in silence. For in the end, it was the whisper of frost and the delicate press of a petal that spoke loudest of all, and guided Miss Marple to the heart of a crime as chilling as winter's coldest dawn. Chapter 10. Aftermath Morning. Light filtered through the tall, frosted windows of Coldthorn Green Manor, revealing a world both changed and unaltered. The garden's ice-carved hedges glinted in the weak sun, but within the house, a sober calm had descended. Tea was served in Mrs. Marwood's petite cup, now symbol of both tragedy and triumph, and the household gathered in the same drawing room where suspicions had bloomed and the killers. Confession had silenced the night. Lady Penrose, her gown soft with morning lilac, presided at the head of the room. By her side sat Miss Ellis, still pale but steady, clutching a small bundle of pressed petals as though they were talismans of survival. Mrs. Harrow hovered near the windowsill, ready to offer fresh cups of tea, her hands steady at last. Colonel Haversham, in full uniform of service, stood by the door to usher in the county coroner and local magistrate, who would arrive shortly, their duty to record the inquest. Miss Marple, seated in her customary corner chair, surveyed the scene with gentle satisfaction. In front of her lay the sketchbook, the diary, and the torn codicil, now restored to its rightful place among Lady Penrose's papers. The story of Mrs. Marwood's final hours had been told, her bravery immortalized in frost-etched letters and botanical clues. And now, as the household rose to their feet, Miss Marple prepared to witness the last formal chapter of the affair. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Dr. Carter entered, carrying the inquest papers and a black-handled briefcase. He exchanged nods with Colonel Haversham before setting the documents on the central table. The coroner, Mr. Prescott, followed, his spectacles perched at the tip of his nose. Behind him came the magistrate, Mrs. Llewellyn, whose austere presence lent gravity to the proceedings. Lady Penrose stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather to record the tragic death of Agatha Marwood, whose life ended in our beloved greenhouse. Thanks to the astute efforts of Miss Marple, we have identified the culprit and preserved Mrs. Marwood's legacy." She paused as the coroner cleared his throat. "Lady Penrose," Mr. Prescott began, peering over his notes, "please state, for the record, how this death came to light." Lady Penrose described the morning's discovery, Mrs. Marwood's final inscription of murder in frost, and the subsequent investigation. Miss Marple's careful questioning, botanical demonstrations, and the final confession by Mr. Hargrave were all recounted with the clarity of fact and the weight of sorrow. When the account concluded, Mr. Prescott looked to Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, as principal investigator, can you confirm that you found sufficient evidence to support the conclusion that Mr. Theodore Hargrave willfully administered poison to the deceased?" Miss Marple rose and nodded, her voice calm. "Yes, the cyanide in Mrs. Marwood's teacup, the bruise on the greenhouse camellia indicating retrieval of the poison bottle, the purple ink petal marking tampering with Lady Penrose's codicil, and the matchbox smeared with aconite for the attempted second poisoning, all point unequivocally to Mr. Hargrave's guilt." A hush fell as Mr. Prescott recorded her statement. Then Mrs. Llewellyn spoke. "Mr. Hargrave stands charged with willful murder. The second, non-fatal attempt underscores premeditation and continued malice. She looked to Colonel Haversham. "Colonel, please see that Mr. Hargrave is taken into custody." The colonel bowed respectfully. Later, as the party dispersed to earlier duties, Miss Marple lingered by a small hearth, where the fire's warmth hinted at spring's promise. Lady Penrose approached, her expression both relieved and mournful. "Agatha," she said softly, "you have saved us from tragedy's shadow. Yet I cannot help but mourn not only my cousin's fall, but the loss of Agatha's gentle spirit." Miss Marple accepted her friend's hand. Tragedy often walks hand in hand with betrayal, but so too does courage. Mrs. Marwood's own intelligence guided our steps, and her final act of defiance pressing that pedal ensured the truth saw the light. Lady Penrose nodded, her eyes misty. "And what of her botanical work? Will her niece inherit as she intended?" Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, the codicil has been restored in your will, and Mrs. Drewell, her niece, will receive the illustrations and the trust established for their preservation. I have already written to her, ensuring she understands her aunt's sacrifice." At that moment, Dr. Carter entered, offering them tea. "Forgive the interruption, ladies," he said, "but the coroner's report confirms both the identity of the poisons and the timeline we discussed." He handed a folded page to Miss Marple, who read it with a nod. "All as we suspected," she remarked, refolding the report. "Now, let us enjoy a moment of ordinary kindness, a cup of tea among friends before the formalities resume." They sat in companionable silence, sipping their tea as Miss Ellis returned the pressed petals to Miss Marple, who tucked them into her reticule. Mrs. Harrow looked on, her usual reserve softened by gratitude. Even Colonel Haversham paused in his duties to offer Miss Marple a polite bow of respect. Later, as the guests prepared to depart, Miss Marple found herself alone in the conservatory. The camellia Mrs. Marwood loved had been renamed in her honor, Marwood Frost. Its petals glowed with dewy promise, unbruised and unbowed. Miss Marple knelt to examine the bloom, feeling the warmth of new life against her fingertips. "I think she would have liked it," she murmured, recalling her friend's passion for botanical nuance. She pressed a gloved fingertip against a petal, not to leave a mark, but in silent recognition of Mrs. Marwood's spirit, which had brought clarity to death's cold grip. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple gathered her coat and hat. Lady Penrose appeared, clutching a small parcel wrapped in violet ribbon. "For you, Agatha," she said, "a token of thanks from me and from Mrs. Drewell, who wanted to send her own." Miss Marple untied the ribbon to reveal a delicate watercolor of the Marwood Frost camellia, rendered in Mrs. Marwood's unmistakable hand. Beneath it, an inscription, "To Agatha, who saw truth in frost." Tears glistened in Miss Marple's eyes as she accepted the painting. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than I can say." Lady Penrose squeezed her friend's hand. "Come, let us step outside. The morning air may refresh us both." Outside, the sun had risen fully, transforming the frost into droplets that sparkled like diamonds. The villagers' gossipers turned mourners, turned believers in justice gathered to bid farewell to their detective. Mrs. Tilling, ever concerned with propriety, curtsied with an earnest flourish. Mr. Ridley clasped her hand in boisterous gratitude. Even the vicar offered a solemn blessing. Miss Ellis, now steadier and more confident, approached. "Miss Marple," she said, "I shall never forget your kindness or Mrs. Marwood's bravery. I hope to carry both forward in my own life." Miss Marple patted her shoulder. "You have already proven yourself courageous, my dear. Remember, the gentlest heart often bears the greatest strength." As the final carriage rolled away, Miss Marple paused at the gate with Lady Penrose and Colonel Haversham. Behind them, the manor stood bathed in new light, its secrets laid bare, its tragedies addressed, its future secure. Lady Penrose inhaled the crisp air, Do you ever tire of these mysteries, Agatha? Miss Marple smiled, gazing down the frost-lined drive. No, my dear. As long as there are truths to uncover and petals pressed for justice, I shall never tire. With that, she adjusted her hat and set off, her soft footsteps echoing on the gravel, leaving behind a village that would long remember the winter when frost spoke murder and one dear detective who listened.